Nestled in the loft of the cabin, where he'd been sleeping since he was a toddler, Nate lay inert and fully clothed under a pile of scratchy wool blankets. Downstairs, he could hear his parents' low murmuring back and forth, his mother's voice a quiver of contralto, his father's the rumbling, steady bass that vibrated through every memory Nate possessed. He reached up and ran his fingers over the bandaged gash on his forehead, pressing until he felt the ache deep down in his skull. If he could just keep the pain present, he thought. If he could stay in the chaotic moment of freefall, the bus tipping into darkness and then bumping down the ravine, he might figure out what had happened. He didn't mean the actual accident itself. There was no explaining that. All Nate could remember was a bright set of headlights filling the bus from behind, then a vicious swerving, and finally the terrible and elongated sensation of teetering on the edge of a precipice. It was the events before that, all the way back to the movie theater in Berlin, that Nate couldn't square. On the way to Berlin, Susie had sat with him the way she always did, her long, jean-encased thigh pressed against his, her bony shoulder poking his bicep. It was nice. They hadn't sat that way for a while. They were too old for the youth group, but Fergus had let them come along tonight anyway, just so they could get out of Titan Falls for a spell. The movie even seemed like it might be good. But Susie had been preoccupied and quiet. She didn't nudge Nate with the point of her elbow and ask if he'd heard any filthy jokes lately. She didn't roll her eyes and snort when he described the touchdown he'd thrown in the last football game. She didn't even snap her gum. Maybe, Nate thought, she's worried about her dad. His own father had fired Mr. Flight, Nate knew. One day, he was all too aware, he would also be expected to make decisions like that, potentially dismissing and bossing boys he'd known all his life. Boys he'd bled for on the athletic field. Boys he wanted to be like, but wasn't quite. Not with a mill to his name. And every day he would work surrounded by thousands of pieces of blank paper, each one a small fate he could choose to blacken if he wanted, or keep pure, sending it out into the wider world like an unfinished prayer for someone else to complete. It was a freedom Nate envied. All the pages of his life were already thoroughly inked with the soot and grease of the mill. His future, written for him. His breath had fogged the bus window, muddling his thoughts. The bus lurched over a pothole, and Susie fell against him, her body a familiar and comforting weight, but with curves now instead of little girl angles. An electric jolt buzzed along Nate's ribs and spine, but if Susie felt it too, she didn't show it. Instead, she squeezed the red mittens she was holding and straightened herself back up, making herself separate again. A lump formed in Nate's throat. Maybe, he thought, she's in love with someone I don't know about. She was antsy during the movie, sighing a lot and jiggling her legs, crossing and uncrossing her ankles. Finally, she stood up and threw her coat around her shoulders. "I'm going outside for a smoke," she whispered. Nate sat alone in the dark, missing her. The fact of her empty seat bothered him, as did Susie's newish habit of cigarettes and her apparent amnesia when it came to any of their old jokes. He glanced behind him, willing her to come drifting back down the aisle, but she didn't. He waited another heartbeat, then another, and then at last stumbled over legs and knees in the dark, apologizing as he passed. If Susie wasn't going to come to him, he'd go to her. He wasn't a smoker, but he was willing to start if it meant he could share something with her again. In the lobby, he blinked from the sudden light, even though the overheads were dim. Through the glass panels of the building's front doors, he saw the blur of Susie's brown plaid coat coming back inside, the sweep of her yellow hair. As if pulled by a beacon, he sailed toward her. "What are you doing?"